previous video, we saw how the rabbis of the Talmud questioned the value of rebuke and decided that it simply isn't as important as humility. When we jump ahead in time to rabbinic works edited during the rise of Islam, we encounter a very different answer to the question of whether or not to rebuke. The late midrashic work known as Tanhuma draws upon the discussion of rebuke we saw in Sifra, but only includes part of Sifra, specifically the interpretation of the biblical verse, and it excludes the rabbinic negative reactions to rebuke. Tanhuma similarly draws upon the Talmud's discussion of rebuke, but excludes part of the passage, only including the positive and rejecting the Talmud's preference for humility. Tanhuma also incorporates other passages related to rebuke from across the Talmud, in order to fashion one long discussion that argues for the supreme importance of rebuke. Let's take a look at one of the passages from the Talmud that Tanhuma introduces. The original passage reads as follows: "Whoever is able to protest against the people of his household and does not protest is caught in the sin of the people of his household. Whoever is able to protest against the people of his city and does not protest is caught in the sin of the people of his city. Whoever is able to protest against the entire world and does not protest is caught in the sin of the entire world." Here the major discussion is about protesting rather than rebuke. But Tanhuma introduces this passage with the line, "And one who does not rebuke is caught in that very sin, as the Master said," which frames the entire passage as a discussion about rebuke. This discussion imagines an ever-expanding obligation to confront wrong in one's household, in one's city, and even in the entire world. In contrast to the Talmud's rejection of rebuke in favor of humility, Tanhuma wholly embraces rebuke as a necessary obligation directed towards injustice, wherever it may be found. But why? Perhaps Tanhuma's endorsement of confrontation corresponds to wider trends in early Islam. In several places in the Quran, we find the obligation of commanding right and forbidding wrong, which is traditionally interpreted as an obligation to confront improper behavior, like the biblical obligation of rebuke. The Tanhuma passage was likely compiled after the rise of Islam, so its editors were part of the broader cultural context that emphasized the importance of confronting others. So while the Talmud rejects rebuke in favor of humility, like sources within an early monastic context, Tanhuma thoroughly embraces rebuke, like the Islamic obligation of forbidding wrong. In this series, we've learned a lot about the Jewish obligation of confrontation. Opening with the Hebrew Bible, we began our study with Leviticus 19:17, which commands that you should reprove your fellow. We then moved to the literary context of this biblical obligation. In video 2, we saw how the commandment to love your neighbor in the next verse informs the understanding of rebuke in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Gospels. In the third video, we looked to Leviticus 19:16, the verse immediately before the obligation of rebuke, to see how slander affects the interpretation of rebuke in Jewish wisdom sources like Ben Sira and the Testament of Gad. In the final 3 videos, we moved to the rabbinic period. We saw how the early rabbinic midrash Sifra highlights the lurking sin at the end of the verse, prompting the rabbis to declare themselves incapable of fulfilling this obligation. In video 5, we encountered the clash between rebuke and humility in the Babylonian Talmud, where the rabbis, like the early monks, decided that humility was preferable. Finally, in this last video, we've seen how the late midrash known as Tanhuma expressed a universal obligation to reprove people for wrongdoing, from one's household to one's city to the entire world. The obligation of confrontation is not a simple task. While standing up against wrongdoing and speaking up in the face of evil may be an ideal, it can be extremely difficult and even quite dangerous. If you're interested in learning more about how Jews and early Christians have embraced, rejected, and understood this biblical obligation, check out my book, The Dangerous Duty of Rebuke, Leviticus 19:17 in Early Jewish and Christian Interpretation. Thanks for watching.